Yo, what's going on guys, Arekkz here, welcome back to another Division video. Now while we wait for Massive to hopefully announce a date for Last Stand, what better way to pass the time than to take a look at another exotic weapon. And today I'm turning my attention to Historian. This is a weapon that I wanted to do a video on a couple of weeks back, but when I got around to testing it in the third phase of the PTS, when it had made the switch from being a skill power focused weapon to a firearms focused weapon, it was broken. To the point where it did practically no damage. You would honestly do more damage just turning the weapon around and beating the enemies around the head with it, because as it existed in Phase 3, it would probably take you about 3, maybe 4 magazines to kill a single enemy. However, in Phase 4 they addressed that, they restored the base damage, and it is now a pretty decent weapon. So with that being said, let's take a look at it. If you do enjoy this, then a like would be super appreciated. Comment down below if you have any questions. But first up, Historian is one of those M1A style marksman rifles. It has a relatively large magazine, a decent fire rate to the point where you can fire it pretty quickly, admittedly at the expense of your accuracy, but either way that is an option. And also to match this, it does have a slightly lower base damage than that of, say, an M44, one of the kind of slower firing bolt action marksman rifles. Also being a marksman rifle, it does have bonus headshot damage, but the reason we're taking a look at this is of course the exotic talent. History repeats. Each bullet embeds itself in the target and detonates 1 second later for 700% of your firearms total. Now, as mentioned, this used to be, at the very beginning of the PTS, focused on skill power, so instead it took your electronics value, but they have since switched this over, so it's now a firearms focused weapon. It's important to note as well that this takes 700% of your firearms value and not your sheet DPS, so you're not looking at 700% of 360,000 DPS, you're looking at 700% of 7,479 firearms, in the case of this build. Of course, depending on your build, that will vary heavily. So it goes without saying that if you want to get the most out of this weapon, you are going to want to spec heavily into firearms, almost to the point where you become a glass cannon, because if you roll firearms on all your pieces of gear, and you throw in firearms mods, then you're going to get a lot more out of this talent. And the other reason I wasn't able to use this in Phase 3 versus Phase 4 is because when they first tested this out, they basically removed the base damage for this gun to the point where it had about 700 base damage, with the intention that the explosion would do the damage. So you would fire a very weak shot, effectively firing peanuts for about 700 damage, and then 1 second later, the explosion would go off for 700% of your firearms. And while the idea is cool, when there is no base damage, then the explosion just doesn't do enough on its own. However, when you factor in base damage, as it exists now, then you have a pretty nice recipe. As you can see here, when I shoot in the firing range, you of course don't get the same explosion effect when on a target, so we'll switch over to AI enemies shortly, but you can see that after the initial shot, the initial kind of damage that you output, 1 second later you get an explosion. That is of course 700% of your firearms. So if I then switch up my gear, throw on some more firearm stuff, and then up that number, you can of course output even more damage. So what this then allows you to do is effectively for every 1 bullet, you have 2 bouts of damage. You have the first shot, and you then have the explosion. This is great because of course when you are fighting, say, AI enemies, it can cause them to stagger. They have toned it down a little bit because also when this was first introduced in the PTS, the stagger was a little bit crazy to the point where it was pretty annoying in PvP. But either way, when you're using this, you can use the kind of explosive stagger to better deal with some enemies. In fact, one of the nice things is, it's almost like a sort of ticking time bomb if you're fighting some enemies and you see that their health bar is pretty low. You of course put a shot in, you can a lot of the time just sort of lead them because you know the explosion will then finish them off. Plus, if you do get rushed down by an enemy and you are up close and personal and you are in a position where you can spam the trigger, then you can take enemies down pretty damn fast. Now with regards to gear sets, if you guys are looking for some recommendations, there are of course a number of different options you could consider, but one of the ones you might want to look at is Deadeye. This is pretty strong right now in 1.6, and while typically people tend to use it with the SVD because it's really stable, accurate, and it's just very easy to spam shots, it could also work quite nicely with Historian. It typically works nicely with those sort of bigger magazine, faster firing marksman rifles, and the main talent, just as a reminder, is that if you aim down sights or you zoom in, you lose your headshot damage multiplier, but you then get 100% guaranteed crit, so that therefore means you can basically spam body shots for critical hit damage and dish out some pretty good numbers. And when you factor that in with, say, the Historian, it's important to understand that the History Repeats talent does not take into account headshot or body shot damage. It is just a flat 700% of your firearms, so whether you shoot someone in the head or the body, it really doesn't matter. So you could take this weapon, spam body shots, also get your explosions off, and actually get some pretty decent results. So something to consider. Also don't forget that if you are using Deadeye, you can throw on a red dot sight and still zoom in, so that way you don't have to worry about a kind of massive 12 times zoom. You can still get the zoom, use the talent, but then make it more usable in the process. Anyway, for the time being, that was a quick look at the Historian. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, drop them down below. And take it easy. Catch you next time. Peace out.